Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are going to study Jeremiah, the prophet Yirmiyahu, chapter 47. The chapter itself is short, but the introduction that I have to give to the chapter so that we can fully understand it will be a little bit longer. We are now in the section where Yirmiyahu turns his attention to the other nations, looks out towards the nations that surrounded Israel, and delivers his prophecies to them. In the last chapter, he discussed Egypt, and we spent some time discussing his prophecies towards Egypt. This chapter is somewhat related to Egypt, which is probably why it's next, but it's directed to the Philistines. Now, if Egypt ever moves an army into Judea, which then gives it access to the rest of the Middle East, it first has to pass through the territory of the Philistines, which is basically had four main cities: Ashkelon and Gat and Gaza. And Gaza was the capital and the largest of the cities. So often the term Gaza or Aza in Hebrew is used to refer to the nation of the Philistines. We know that they originally came from the prophets say several times that the Philistines originally came from Kaftor, which is Hebrew for the island of Crete. We also know, interestingly, from recent DNA studies of findings of remains in the area, that they had the European origins and likely came from the Aegean Sea, which kind of confirms what the Bible had said about the origins of the Philistines. But they set up shop in the coastal cities, and they eventually became implacable enemies of the people of Israel. And there was constant battles back and forth, which eventually led to the need for the Israelites to establish their own king, the first king Saul, primarily in order to defend the Israelites against the Philistines. So they were a foe of the Israelites and the people of Judah for many years. Now, in this chapter that I'm about to read, in my introduction, I want to discuss two subjects. First of all, there's a famous discussion regarding the first verse of the chapter, which I'm going to read to you in a minute. But the verse refers to when Pharaoh attacked Egypt. Now, it's unclear, and there's a lot of debates as to when this happened. The two most likely candidates are, if you recall a couple chapters ago, we read about how Egypt came to try to relieve the siege of the Babylonians against Judah. This is when the Babylonians had laid siege on Jerusalem, and then the Babylonians had to leave the siege and go fight the Egyptians. When the Egyptians left, the Egyptians were defeated and left. When they left, they presumably also left fortifications and alliances with the Philistines. Eventually, after the Babylonians crushed Judah, they turned their attention to Egypt and destroyed, attacked and defeated Egypt and the Philistines together. So in this chapter, we're going to read about how the prophet Jeremiah said his prophecy before Egypt attacked the Philistines. This is one possibility, that during that attempt to rescue Judah from the Babylonians, that the Egyptians attacked the Philistines on the way. Another possibility moves it a little bit earlier in history, to the time that the Egyptian army also moved north, also to engage the Babylonians. But this was when they came north, about 15, 20 years earlier, during the reign of Jehoiakim of Judah, when they were on their way to the Battle of Carchemish to help the Assyrians in their fight against the Babylonians. The Egyptians then also would have had to go through Gaza, and would have, which would move this prophecy then back about 20 years. So the prophecy would have been during the early days of Jehoiakim, when Jeremiah said this prophecy. There's also other suggestions, but those are the two of the most likely ones. Regardless, when we read this chapter, we're going to read about how Jeremiah said this prophecy before Egypt attacked the Philistines, and then he's going to prophesize how eventually the Babylonians are going to come and attack and crush both the Philistines and the Egyptians. The next issue that I want to talk about is why the Philistines. This chapter is going to basically state, as we see in many places in the in the words of the prophets, that the Philistines are going to be completely crushed and never to return onto the world stage again after the Babylonians conquer the Philistines and then attack the Egyptians. Why, and what was their sin? What was the big deal about the Philistines, and why were they being completely destroyed by the Babylonians? So in order to answer this question, I'm going to give a review of the other prophets. We're going to look through the other prophets and see how they discuss the sins of the Philistines and how they all predict the same ultimate destruction coming from the north, which is a reference to Babylon. I think that going over the words of all the other prophets and then studying this chapter in Jeremiah will give us a much broader picture and understanding of the issues with the Philistines. So I'm going to start with the prophecy of Amos, the prophet Amos. This is chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, where Amos is also in Amos 1, he's also, just as Jeremiah is now, turning his attention to prophesying about the other nations. And when he turns to talk about Gaza and the Philistines, he says as follows. Ko Amar Adonai, so says God. This is verse 6, Amos 1. Ashlosha Pishei Gaza, on the three sins of Gaza, I can pass over. This is the language that Amos uses repeatedly. But on the fourth, that was just too much. I can't take it anymore. Al haglotam galut shleimal haskir le'edom. And this refers to that they exiled an entire population, and then they sold them into slavery in Edom. The commentaries over there explain that when the people of the Philistines would win in battle, they didn't just destroy the enemy. They would humiliate the enemy. They would take the enemy and then sell them as slaves to others. Humiliate them in such fashion. In other words, a double cruelty. So it's this double cruelty that God just could not bear that sin anymore, and for that, God says, "V'shilachti eish b'chomat Gaza." I am going to send a flame to the walls of Gaza, and I'm going to destroy it, and so on. And in verse 8, it says, "V'chrati yoshev me'ashdod." I will completely cut off any remnant of people living in Ashdod, v'tomech shevet, and any ruler from Ashkelon. I will never. And then it says again, "V'avdu she'erit pleishtim." There will be no remnant. There will be no leftover of the Philistines. That's the word in Amos. I'm going to go now to Ezekiel 25, verse 15. And here, Ezekiel states that also addresses the Philistines. And it says, Ko Amar Adonai Elohim, so says God. This is verse 15, chapter 25. Ya'an asot Philistine b'nekama. Because the Philistines, when they act violently to their enemies, they act with such vengeance. Vayinakmu nakama b'sha'ot b'nefesh. And they take double extra vengeance with hatred, and hatred of soulful hatred, l'mashchit evat olam, to destroy with an enmity that's just everlasting and incredibly powerful enmity. So Ezekiel is here criticizing the incredible vengeance with which they fought, the incredible brutality with which the Philistines treated their enemies. Lachain, therefore, Ko Amar Adonai, Hineni notei yadi ala Plishtim. I am going to stretch my hand against the Plishtim. V'ichrati et kretim. I'm going to wipe out the survivors. I will completely wipe them out. And then it goes on verse 16 and 17 with the same theme. So again, we see that the cruelty with which they treated the people that they conquered, their utter brutality and barbarism with which they treated their enemy was the reason why God said there will be nothing left of the Philistines. Like, couldn't say anything positive about them. Now I'm just to continue. Let's look at Isaiah 14, verse 29 to 32. And here I need to point out that Isaiah is saying what he says over there in the context of the death of the evil king of Achaz. If one remembers the wars that went back and forth between the Philistines and the Judeans, it was under some kings one side was winning, under some kings the other side is winning. The king Uzziah, who was a righteous king, he crushed the Philistines and subjugated them. When he died, his son Achaz was wicked, and the Philistines struck back, and they beat Achaz, and their hand was mightier. But then Achaz died, and his son Chizkiah who was again a righteous king. He got the upper hand over the Philistines. I'm saying this is all in Chronicles and Kings, the back and forth of who's winning and who's losing between the Judeans and the Philistines. Now, in this context, Yeshayahu 14, verse 29 to 32 says as follows: "Don't be happy, al tismechi peleshes kulech. Don't rejoice, you the Philistines, ki nishbar shevet makech, that the person who broke your staff is broken." Why? In other words, don't be so happy that Achaz died. Your enemy Achaz died, because you're going to be destroyed. Chizkiyahu his son is going to come kimishorish nachash, from the root where the snake came from. Yitzhak comes the poison, because Chizkiyahu is going to come and conquer you again. Then he continues but however, in there, Yeshayahu gives a very important prophecy, and I want to go back to, if you have a chance to listen to my podcast on Isaiah 14c, where I describe this in detail. But over here, Yeshayahu explains what it is about the Philistines that is the reason why, when the Judeans have a righteous king, they will beat out the Philistines. And he explains, as we see in verse 30 and 31, that they had no mercy on the poor. They had no the poor of their nation had no mercy. They had no empathy. They had no. They're just a completely unsophisticated and barbaric society in which only the mighty and powerful were the leaders, and that was it. And that this was the reason why the Judeans. I would read through 14, but it's several verses, and the argument that I made to prove that this is the meaning of Isaiah 14, I already said at length in the podcast 14c. So we see a barbaric society. We see a society that treats its enemies with incredible brutality, and for this reason, Isaiah tells the Philistines that they're going to lose out. And then finally, I want to look at the prophet Zephaniah 2. In chapter 2, look at verse 3 through 7. And it's important to look at the context, because it says, Bakshu et Adonai, this is verse 3, Kolam Ve'ar. It's all humble people of the land search for God, Asher Mishpato Pa'alu, because they have fulfilled his rules. And what are the rules of God? Bakshu Tzedek, you should search for righteousness. Bakshu Hanavah, search for humility. Ulai Tisasru B'yom Haftatanai, perhaps if you follow on the path of God, then you will be spared on the day of judgment. And then immediately he says, Ki Aza Azuva tiyeh, because the people of Aza, the Philistines, will be completely deserted. Ashkelon lishmama, they will be destroyed. So again, and it continues, again he predicts the destruction of Aza. And over there in that context, and this is what's important there, the context is that Zephaniah is saying that I want justice and righteousness. The opposite of that is Aza, those that had no justice, no righteousness, nothing nothing good at all to say about their society. And he continues to say that they're going to be completely cut off and completely destroyed. And just as we're saying this over here. Now, with all of this background, we can start reading Jeremiah 47. So again, let's see verse 1. This is the word of God to Jeremiah the prophet to the Philistines. And he said this before Pharaoh struck Gaza, before Pharaoh attacked the Philistines. And like I already said it early on in the introduction, the two most likely possibilities of which time Pharaoh attacked Gaza is referring to. Ko amar Adonai, so says God, Hine mayim olim mitzafon, there are waters coming up from the north, v'hayu l'nachal shotef, and they are going to be like a raging torrent, like a nachal is a wadi when it fills with rushing water. V'yishtifu eretz u'maloa, and it's going to overflow the land and everything in it. Ir v'yoshvei, by the cities and everyone who resides there. V'zo'aku ha'adam, and people are going to cry out. V'helil kli yoshev, it's all of those that reside in the lands occupied by the Philistines are going to be screaming and shrieking in terror. This Olim Mitzafon is referring to the Babylonians that are ultimately going to come and destroy the Egyptian presence in Philistines and the Philistines themselves, and it's going to be a complete and total destruction. Mikol sha'atas parsosa birov, at the sound of the pounding hooves of his stallions, meirash lirichbo, the roar of his chariots, hamon gal galav, and the rumbling of the myriads of wheels of his chariots, lo hifnu avot albanim merifyun yadayim, the fear struck in the hearts of the people was such that the men didn't even have a chance to turn around and look after the well-being of their children. The fear was so awful. Thinking about how barbaric we describe the Philistines as being, the fact that the parents didn't look back at the welfare of their children makes one wonder what kind of people they were. But on the other hand, it's hard to judge based on how this horror is being described. Al hayom haba lishdod eskala plishtim, because of the day that is coming when the Philistines will be completely devastated. Liachrit litzor litzidon, to cut off from Tyre and Sidon. The reason why Tyre and Sidon were populated by Phoenicians, the Phoenicians were very closely related ethnically, genetically to, and culturally to the Philistines, and they also lived in, they were seafaring peoples, and they were allies. They were close allies. But these allies are going to be completely cut off. Kol shridos there, any kind of help that could come from them will be completely gone. Why? Because God is plundering, God is destroying the Philistines who are the refugees that came from the island of Crete. Because originally it was known that this was the origin of where they had come from. Ba'a karcha al Azza. Gaza has been shorn like bald. Nidmusa Ashkelon shehiritim kam. Ashkelon, which is another one of their main cities, has been cut off. Admatai titkodadi. How long will they have to suffer and gash themselves in mourning, as was the custom in those days in the Philistines, to gash themselves in mourning over a tragedy? And then Jeremiah sees this awful tragedy occurring, and you can feel a little bit of mercy. Hoi cherev la'Adonai, O sword of God. Ad ona lo tishkoti, until when will you not stop this and just be quiet? He asvi al ta'arech ragiva domi. withdraw into your scabbard. In other words, why don't put your sword back into its sheath? Calm down, be quiet, rest. But no, God answers, Ech tishkoti, how could I answer? Actually, it's as if the sword is answering. I cannot be quiet. God has commanded her. God has commanded the sword, Al Ashkelon v'Alchof Hayam Sham Yada, regarding Ashkelon and those other cities that are on the coast. That is where it has an appointment. That is where God has set the target of this sword. The sword will therefore not turn around. So Jeremiah here is repeating the prophecies that we saw in all of the other prophets in our introduction to this chapter. And although Jeremiah doesn't go too much into detail as to what the sins of the Philistines are, but he's prophesying the same thing. And as we do know, after the Babylonian conquest of the Philistines and then they went on to attack Egypt, there never was any more remnant of the Philistine Empire. Thank you so much for studying chapter 47 together. Looking forward to studying chapter 48 and, of course, the entire book of Jeremiah and beyond.